Please remain standing for the reading of the Gospel of Luke, the 12th chapter. Someone in the crowd said to Jesus, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the family inheritance with me." But he said to him, "Friend, who set me to be judge or arbitrator over you?" Then he said to them, "Take care, be on your guard against all kinds of greed, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of possessions." Then he told them a parable. The land of a rich man produced abundantly, and he thought to himself, "What should I do? For I have no place to store my crops." Then he said, "I will do this. I will pull down my barns and build larger ones, and there I will store up all my grain and my goods, and I will say to my soul, 'Soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, be merry.' But God said to him, 'You fool, this very night your life is being demanded of you, and the things you have prepared, whose will they be?' So it is with those who store up treasure for themselves, but are not rich toward God." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Please be seated. So Jesus chose to use this form of teaching that we've been exploring all throughout the summer, a parable, a story that teaches us something along the way. And so I thought it would be fun for one of the messages on a parable to tell you a story. So I wrote a story based on Jesus' story that I hope will have that same instructive quality that Jesus included in his stories. My story is called, "Ever Seen a Hearse with a Luggage Rack?" Jim could hardly believe his eyes. The numbers were in big block letters on the lottery program, and he was looking at exactly the same numbers on his ticket. He had won $100 million. Finally, the words started to form in his mouth, and he said, "I won." And he kept repeating it louder each time. Of course, people started to slap him on the back and congratulate him, and Jim yelled out something he had always wanted to do at his favorite bar: "The drinks are on me." As might be expected, the bar erupted with cheers, and Jim felt on top of the world. But it's funny how that can slip away. It started with a couple of friends joking, "Hey Jim, can I borrow $10,000? And then they would laugh. But as the night went on, Jim started to hear about kids who needed braces, friends who were behind on their mortgage, and people who knew of a great deal that he ought to look into. Jim had heard about lottery winners being overwhelmed with requests, but he thought it would take a little while. Obviously not. When the camera crew from the local TV station arrived, Jim realized the bar manager must have called them as a way of getting some free publicity. Of course, they set up their lights and cameras and then asked Jim the usual questions. How does it feel? What are you going to do with all the money? Will you move? And a few others. Jim gave the usual responses. "It feels great. I'll pay off a lot of bills, probably get a new car, might get a new house." Of course, they pried and found out that he was divorced and had 2 daughters who could now attend any college they wanted. And then the reporter had asked if he was going to give anything to charity. He later realized it sounded pretty shallow, but after a few drinks, he was a bit more honest than prudent, and so he said, "I've given enough to charity already." And it was true. Jim had supported his church, at least up until the divorce with Arlene 6 years ago. He'd stopped after that because, as he jokingly said, she got the church in the settlement, and he'd given to a couple of charities throughout the years. But it was still pretty callous because obviously he could give a lot more now. It was about 10 p.m. when Jim decided to slip out of the excitement he had created and head on home. Maybe call his daughters before it was too late. But a few miles down the road, his ancient Oldsmobile started coughing and grinding and coasted to a stop. Jim got out and stormed away. Who needed the old car anyway? He'd just leave it here. Tomorrow morning, he would buy himself a brand new Ferrari, or maybe a different colored one for every day of the week. Or better yet, Jim ought to hire a limousine. Isn't that how multimillionaires got around, in a big black limousine? But as he was walking along, he was startled from these thoughts as he noticed that he wasn't in the greatest part of town. Cruising through his neighborhood each night from work, Jim had always locked his car doors there, so it was actually the kind of place where you didn't want to take a late night stroll. Being on foot caused him to notice that many of the shops were boarded up, the street lights were broken, and in places the garbage was piled 6 foot high. More importantly, Jim also started to notice that there were a lot of young men hanging around who looked like they might be in gangs. Even his dirty work clothes probably didn't make him stand out that much, Jim knew. Almost on an animal level, he started to feel out of place, that he was in danger. He even started to feel like someone, maybe even a few people, were following him, recognizing him as an easy target. It was then that he saw the lights streaming out of a building up ahead and saw the brightly lit cross that said, "Jesus saves." Jim had always considered himself a religious person, but never so much as at that moment. As he planned to dart into the storefront church, he really felt like Jesus was saving him. And this was truer than he could ever imagine. Well, when Jim walked through the thick door, he suddenly realized that this wasn't a church. It was a homeless shelter. Inside were older men in tattered clothes, younger women who had that tired, weary look that made them seem older, and there were even little children in dirty clothes playing on the worn wooden floor. The barrel-chested man at the door welcomed him and directed him toward a hot cup of coffee, which gave Jim time to think. He knew better than to ask for a phone. No cabbie in his right mind would come to this neighborhood at this hour. So Jim decided not to let them know that he wasn't homeless. Maybe they would make him leave then. Instead, he decided to spend the night there. It actually wasn't such a bad idea. He would get a free meal, sleep over, catch a cab in the morning, and this would be his way of saying goodbye to his pathetic old life, and then tomorrow he would start living like the millionaire he was. But Jim learned an awful lot that night, and none of it had anything to do with being a millionaire. As he sat with people and talked to them that night, he met a woman whose husband had went out for cigarettes one morning and never came back. So there she was, caring for 2 active boys, being bounced from one agency to another until she had been evicted and come to this shelter at this mission. Another person Jim met was an old black man that everyone called Waving Willie. It didn't take long to realize why he had received this unusual name. Every few minutes, Willie's hand, for no apparent reason, would start to flap and flutter as though butterflies had invaded it. It took just a few more minutes with Willie to know why he was there. He obviously had mental problems, but probably some institution had run out of room so they had put him out on the street, dooming him to live in a place like this. Jim had heard it wasn't uncommon. Someone like Willie wasn't ill enough to need to be back in the institution, and yet he wasn't well enough to get a job or function on the outside world. One of the scariest people Jim met that night was a guy named Bob Maston. What made his time with Bob scary wasn't that he was mentally ill, nor addicted or anything, nor lazy or dependent on welfare. In fact, Bob was none of the things that Jim associated with the homeless. What made Bob scary, he was just like Jim. Same age, same background, including the divorce, but also a little turn of bad luck. Bob's company had moved down to Mexico, leaving him with no job or pension. Now he was 55 years old with limited job skills, which no one wanted to hire. The unemployment had held off his creditors for a time, but eventually the bank repossessed his house, and Bob had found himself homeless, depending on shelters like this one. Jim learned a lot that night, a lot about himself, and a lot about what he could do with his lottery windfall. As he laid on the cot in the old musty shelter that night, he thought about a number of things, about all these people that needed help, and especially his comment to the reporter, "I've given enough to charity already." It wasn't just shallow, it was heartless. Two things continued to bother Jim throughout that night. One was a tune on the radio that he vaguely recognized as Don Henley of the Eagles. It was called "Gimme What You Got." And the last line of the song went, "But you don't see no hearses with luggage racks." The other thing that nagged at Jim was the Bible story that the old retired Baptist pastor who ran the mission had read. Jim had heard it many times at his church, but had never really listened to it. It was a parable that Jesus taught about a farmer who had such a huge harvest that the farmer decided to tear down his barns and build much bigger ones. Then he would be happy and comfortable and secure. But on that night, God said, "You fool, it's the end of your life, and none of your wealth makes any difference." Jim had one crystal clear dream that night. He was again sitting at the bar with the camera lights shining on him, and the pretty TV lady was again asking him if he was going to give anything to charity. But this time, Jim's answer was the right one. "Yes, I'm going to give a lot. With all this money, I can help a lot of people." Amen.